It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And of course, that means some smart talk radio is in your future, and this segment certainly no exception. A subject that is going to be an interesting one indeed. We're going to be talking about a brand new work called City on a Grid, How New York Became New York, talking to author, historian, former broadcaster, and all-around good guy, Gerard Koepple. A long history in the broadcasting world, as well as research, historian. He lives in New York City, talks about the city that he loves. Previous work called The Encyclopedia of New York City, et al. Gerard, how are you, my friend?
Very good. Good to talk to you, Warner.
Tell you what, when you tackle a work like this, City on a Grid, How New York Became New York, I can imagine the inspiration for it, but boy, where do you start?
Where did I start getting into this? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, where did you start? What was the starting point for this one?
Well, it's kind of interesting. I first started thinking about this topic actually right after 9/11. So my first book was called Water for Gotham. It was a history of water in New York City. And in the course of that book, I came upon what I think is my all-time favorite image of old New York. And it is the corner of Greenwich and Day Street, D-E-Y, Day Street, way downtown, painted by actually a French woman who lived across the street. And it shows the street corner in 1810 and focuses on a woman helping her child, unclear if it's a boy or girl, pump water from a street well. And I use that image in my water book. That corner of Greenwich and Day disappeared with the first World Trade Center footprint. So in other words, the first World Trade Center footprint was very large, and it covered up a lot of old intersections. Well, after 9/11, the World Trade Center footprint is a good bit smaller. And lo and behold, that intersection, which was gone for about 40 years or so after the first World Trade Center was built, lo and behold, that intersection reappeared. And there is now, again, an intersection of Greenwich and Day Streets. And that got me thinking, well, maybe the street arrangement of New York City, of Manhattan especially, is a little bit more plastic than I imagined. And so I started just poking around and looking at the history of the streets and how they got to be that way. And, long story short, because we don't have too much time here, I eventually decided to write a book about the creation of the Manhattan street grid, what led to it, and its relatively long life since the plan was first announced in 1811.
You know, as a form and as a process of sort of civil engineering, traffic engineering, et cetera, how was that decision made that it should be, so to speak, on a grid versus normal development, let's say contrasted by the city of Boston, which is sort of done in circles if I have my history somewhat right. But why a grid versus any other design?
You know, it's a darn good question. And the guys who actually came up with the plan never really fully explained themselves. You mentioned Boston. Boston is like the antithesis of New York in the sense that Boston has never really had much of a plan. It's sort of just spread out from the waterfront and from the beginning, and certain portions are planned now, but it's generally, pretty much, a madhouse in terms of its street arrangements. Now, New York City started about the same way at the southern tip of Manhattan Island when it was founded by the Dutch as New Amsterdam in the early 1600s, and through the Revolution and into the early days of the American city, the city had no plan. Basically, streets were laid by landowners. And the city government was relatively small, relatively deferential toward landowners, and it essentially pretty much approved whatever landowners decided to do. Once you started getting into the early 1800s, certain city fathers, weren't any city mothers then, city fathers then said, this place is a mess, and we're really going to have to come up with some kind of plan for the future development. And somebody unasked had offered a plan in 1803, a Frenchman who had come to New York, a guy named Joseph Francois Mangin, M-A-N-G-I-N, now pronounced locally Mangin. He's actually the designer of New York's now iconic City Hall. But he had come up with a plan for the future development of the island, unasked for, in which he essentially would have made certain portions of the island moving forward from the city, and I should note the city at this point is still confined to the southern tip of Manhattan, the very southern tip. He would have built small segments of grid, some of them very densely streeted, some of them more broadly, in sort of a patchwork at irregular angles to each other. So essentially sort of an irregular patchwork of grids. And in the intersections of all those grids, all kinds of opportunities, irregularly shaped opportunities for the siting of small parks, of public buildings, of other places of public gathering, much like, he being a Frenchman, much like Paris. Now, that plan he came out with in 1803. Everybody loved it for a while, and then for a number of reasons that we probably don't really have time to talk about here, but is detailed in the book, that plan went away in 1803, and in 1807, the city finally said, okay, we need some real professional planning here. They went to the state for a law. The state passed a law forming a three-man commission, and that commission in 1807 was given 4 years to come up with a plan that would be binding. Whatever they came up with is how Manhattan would look. There could be no legal objection to it. And that commission was run, there was three men, it was dominated by an aging founding father named Gouverneur Morris. Probably, not too many students of early American history know the name, but everybody is pretty much familiar with the preamble to the Constitution, we the people of these United States. Well, that was created by Gouverneur Morris. He was one of the most active guys at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. He also had many, many other accomplishments. But in 1807, he was put in charge of the commission, and he and his fellow commissioners 4 years later came up with this vast, unbroken, rectilinear street grid. And people are wondering, that big clump of Central Park in the middle of the island now, that was not in the plan. That was added in the 1850s. And people may be wondering, well, what about Broadway slashing through the middle of the grid there at an angle? Also not in the plan. It existed, the lower portions of Broadway at the time, but the commissioners would have cut it off at what they were calling 14th Street, now Union Square. It wasn't going to continue past there, Broadway, but turned out that so many people lived along that road, because that road continued all the way up through the western side of the island as a thing called Bloomingdale Road, just sort of a country road. But there were so many landowners along that road that eventually Broadway was going to put back into the plan. And in the 1850s, I think, as I mentioned, certain forward-thinking people thought, my God, we are going to have ourselves such a densely gridded place with no breathing room. We need to put a park here somewhere. And that's how the fairly large Central Park came to be.
You just joined us. Yours truly, Warner Lewis, from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio, talking to Gerard Koepple. Fascinating work, brand new, called City on a Grid, How New York Became New York. Gerard, author of numerous books in the past, including Water for Gotham. He's also been a producer for CBS and Mutual Radio. Gerard, got a question for you here. As they began to lay out this grid, was part of the grid the thought behind it possibly? We are aware, even though it's in the early 1800s, that this place we call New York will one day be a very, very large place populated by lots of people. Before it gets completely insane, let's put some kind of a structure and order to it. Was that sort of the motivation? Does that make sense?
Absolutely, and I realize that, I probably went on a bit there in my answer to your last question, but I didn't really answer your question, which is how did they come up with their plan? They could have come up, the commissioners of 1807, with anything they wanted. They could have, for example, come up with something that looked like Washington, D.C., which had recently been designed, with a lot of diagonals and a lot of variation, though with an underlying grid. But as they explained, as our commissioners explained in 1811 when they came up with when they announced their big grid, they explained in some very brief reports, nothing substantial. They were not required to explain themselves in detail. They just actually submitted about 8 pages of handwritten, what they called remarks. In any case, they wrote. One of the things they might have considered were the, quote, supposed improvements by circles, ovals, and stars, which certainly embellish a plan, whatever may be their effect as to convenience and utility. They said, nah, none of that. What they said was, quote, a city is to be composed principally of the habitations of men, they weren't too much concerned with women, and straight-sided houses, and straight-sided and right-angled houses are the most cheap to build and the most convenient to live in. And so the easiest way to make right-angled houses was to make right-angled streets to put them on.
Right.
And that's what we've got.
And I'm curious as to, at the time, the mode of transportation would have at best been a carriage, horses, buggies, etc. No thought about a motorized vehicle. But in your opinion, how does the grid system work out accommodating traffic?
Well, there's your big problem with the grid. There are many, but the big one is congestion. Manhattan has been a hopelessly congested place, for a long time. You're right. When the grid plan was announced in 1811, the only thing moving on the streets, the existing streets already, and the new streets that would be built as the grid developed, as it moved further up the island, were things that had feet or wheels, and none of it mechanized.
Not much gridlock when you're talking buggies, right?
Exactly. And what happens, though, is pretty soon after the grid starts taking shape, and, the grid it's not like a bridge, let's say, which, you make a plan for a bridge, here are the plans, you build it, and it's done. A grid isn't really done until the whole space that you imagine it filling is filled. And that took until the very late 1800s, actually, to actually complete, quote-unquote, the grid. But in any case, by about the 1830s, what starts happening but railways? And railways start using the avenues on rights of way that are granted to them. And then, of course, by a century later, you get cars, which are their own issue. And what you have now is a very congested place, largely because, and there's maybe one great fault of the grid, aside from it just being so regimented and unbroken, is that there are many cross streets which are only 60 feet wide, and relatively few avenues, really only about 12 of them, which are 100 feet wide. And so what happens is you have a lot of ways on this grid to go across the island, but not many ways to go up and down it. And so let's say you're on a block between 5th and 6th Avenues. That block is 920 feet long. So once you're on it, you've got to go 920 feet until you can get off it. And I think, and I'm not the first one to say this, but other people have said this, that probably the Manhattan grid should have had twice as many north-south avenues as it does. But back in 1811, when the commissioners announced their plan, and remember that Manhattan is an island, the only way to access it is by the water. There are no bridges or tunnels yet. So how do you access the island? You access it from the water. And so you want as many ways to move from the edge of the island to the center of the island. So movement is primarily lateral across the island. So that's why you have lots of streets.
So
Back in the early 1800s, you didn't move north and south. There was no uptown, downtown, midtown, so you didn't need too many avenues.
All right, so put Gerard Koepple back in that room, back in those meetings, back in the early 1800s, and you said, you know what, I've seen the future, and here's what it's all about. It's all about automobiles, subways, streetcars, etc. How might that have changed? Would they have gone away completely from a grid, or wider streets, or fewer streets, or how would that have been handled, do you think?
You know, it's like one of those great mysteries. You wish that there was a lot of writing from the three commissioners about their decision-making. And I'll just mention, besides Gouverneur Morris, who kind of ran the show, he, by the way, had a big estate on the mainland opposite Manhattan in the Bronx. Some of your listeners may be familiar with the neighborhood of Morrisania in the Bronx. It's near where Yankee Stadium is. That was where Gouverneur Morris's estate was. One of the other guys on the commission was Simon DeWitt. He was for 50 years the state surveyor general of New York. He knew a lot about making maps. He lived in Albany, didn't care much for Manhattan. He'd made maps during the Revolution for Washington, George Washington. Could have had a job with the federal government, decided, I liked Albany better. And the third guy was a guy named John Rutherford. That's U-R-D at the end, not O-R-D. As the name is often misspelled these days. He was the largest landowner in New Jersey. And you would have thought, you would have liked, somehow amongst these three guys, to find some archival material, some letters, some diary entries. Morris kept a very detailed diary, explaining just what the heck, why they decided to do what they did. And those explanations, as far as I can tell through my research and other people before me, it doesn't exist.
Was New York considered at the time, well, we can't really say at the time, but let's dial up now to, let's just say, to 1880. Cities like Los Angeles, cities like Chicago look to the east. Were there lessons learned from New York? Because if you go to Los Angeles, God knows how they designed that one. Did anybody learn anything? What did we learn from all of this?
Well, I think, in 1880, maybe New York isn't quite deeply congested, right? Cars haven't really happened yet. And the urban grid is seen as a great and efficient way to lay out a city. It's easy to build, certainly. It's easy to design. It's easy to build. If, of course, you have like a flatland that you can do it on. Chicago was easy to do. L.A. somewhat less so, but still pretty much so. Manhattan, by the way, the actual name Manhattan comes from the Lenape native word, which I will not try to pronounce, but supposedly meant island of hills. Manhattan was not really a conducive place to actually make a grid. A lot of work went into basically chopping down the hills and filling the valleys with them. But for a long time, making grids was the most efficient way to make a city. Now, one of the things that nobody ever thought about then were environmental concerns. Putting green in a city, making use of natural waterways. For example, using gray water from streams to grow green things along the roads, along the streets. Manhattan was filled with streams and ponds. They're all buried now. They're all still there. Right. And when we humans go away, those ponds and streams will come back.
They will re-arise. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, as we start to wind down, there's a great quote in the book from Walt Whitman, written in the Sunday Dispatch in 1849. Our perpetual dead flat and streets cutting each other at right angles are certainly the last things in the world consistent with beauty. You love New York or you hate it. Walt Whitman probably had a little bit of mixed feelings about it. But what is again, as you look back, the city on a grid, how New York became New York, Gerard Koepple, what is there a headline from all of this, and beyond the fact that it is an extraordinary historical document, what's the lesson out of all of this?
I would say that I wouldn't say there's one particular lesson. I would say, as with anything, there's always that eternal, like, chicken and egg question. Did the grid, which organized the future of a originally very disorganized city at the southern tip of the island, did that grid provide sort of a power and an organization that enabled that city to become great? Or was that city going to become great anyway, and the grid made it possible? Or would the city have become great, and it didn't matter how the city was physically arranged? I think it's it's really an unanswerable question. I think it's just one of those speculations that is interesting to do, and it's interesting to do when you know the history of how the grid came to be.
Right.
And I think that's what I'm up to in this book.
Well, it is a fascinating look at a fascinating subject and a fascinating city. The work is called City on a Grid, How New York Became New York, by Gerard Koepple, well-known in his work in broadcasting and well-known also in his work, particularly his love affair and historical works about New York City. I assume it is available at Amazon and other the normal standard local retailers. Well, how can people find out more about some of the writing and the work that you do?
Well, you can go to my website, GerardKoepple.com. You can go on Facebook, where the book City on a Grid has a page. I also tweet. I've been dragged into the into the Twitterati by the publicist for the book. She says, Gerard, you just really have to tweet.
Yep. Whether you like it or not.
As long as you have the spelling for my name and you Google it, you'll find all these things.
Okay. Well, listen. Hey, thank you so much for spending time with us. It's a fascinating work indeed. And what's your next project?
Oh, that's a good question. A couple of things. Thinking about a few different things. I run them past my agent. My agent generally says no, 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 and then eventually he says yes.
You just wear him down. I like it. Okay, listen, have a great day. And again, thanks so much.
Warner, thank you.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.